So, hi everyone. Oh, hey, thanks for responding. So, thanks for tuning in to my presentation. And I'm here today to discuss my work as an advocate or youth leader from the Asian American Student Advocacy Project. So, feel free to interrupt me anytime by typing in any questions you have in the chat. Or if you have any concerns or anything you would like me to talk about, feel free to just enter that in the chat and I'll just respond right away. So, on to the presentation. First of all, I just want to say thank you for showing up today because oftentimes people don't know much about this issue to begin with. People don't realize that there's a need for culturally competent mental health services. And I'll just begin by describing the program that I'm part of. So I'm a youth activist, generally speaking, and I'm also from the Asian American Student Advocacy Project, also known as ASAP. And what I do as an advocate is I try to educate young people and myself to empower ourselves and really advocate for culturally competent mental health services or just any issues facing the Asian Pacific American community. So what this means is we really try to break stereotypes, paint the full pictures behind them, allocate for resources. Oh, hey, Carlene. We really try to allocate for resources and try to maintain this type of advocacy on a system-wide level, on a systemic level. We're really trying to promote standing in solidarity with other minorities, making sure that we're able to amplify the voices of marginalized communities and really shed light on the diaspora of Asian Pacific Americans and our unique needs. So moving on, I just want to first go over the concept known as the model minority myth. So before starting, let's take a look at this graphic over here. So we see that there's so many different ethnicities, Asian Pacific American group. In the first place, when I'm mentioning these groups, we have to realize that they're not a monolith. We can't just lump everyone together. We can't just say, oh, just because someone is Japanese or just because someone is Vietnamese, they're going to be automatically a monolith together. So we can't do that, and we have to acknowledge every community's unique needs, which is why when you see that there is 26% of the Hmong population in the US, and even 20% of the Bangladeshi population in the US suffering from extreme poverty, so this diagram is showing extreme poverty, we know that not everyone is doing as well as society makes us out to be. So what does this mean? What does this all tie together? So we know that the model minority myth is the idea that Asian Pacific American individuals are all successful or hardworking or competent in their own ways. But really, we have to acknowledge how a lot of the times that myth obscures the real struggles that a lot of us are facing as marginalized communities. That myth that we're competent worker bees, submissive individuals who are fetishized, all that really does not account for how a lot of us face poverty, face discrimination on rampant levels, face hate crimes that people do not acknowledge because the media invisibilizes us or renders us voiceless. And that happens a lot of the times. So that's why for ASAP, to shorten this, because this is a really in-depth topic, to shorten this, we can say that ASAP wants to make sure that there is cultural competency. So let me just quickly go over what cultural competency is. So cultural competency, and I'm just going to quickly switch to another tab, which is why you all see my face and not the video right now. But cultural competency, to define that quickly, because I was a bit confused at first, represents the idea that we are going to try to target making sure that whomever we're dealing with has the resources that they need and based on their culture. So what this means is that if we know someone's cultural background, we have the judgment to consider their cultural background and to really apply that to any services that we use. So if we're dealing with an immigrant, we're going to make sure that we translate our resources. If we're dealing with an undocumented immigrant, we're going to make sure that they feel safe and that they have the mental health services needed to deal with how they might have trouble getting a passport in any way. Oh yeah, like Jonathan said, I really love any questions, so feel free to type anything and I'll just answer them. So remember how for a lot of Asian Pacific American individuals, people don't really know that mental health is a huge problem. It's one of the main problems in which our communities are disadvantaged. People don't realize that for mental health stigma, Asian Pacific Americans face a lot of suicidal ideation. A lot of us are really at risk for social anxiety. A lot of us are really at risk for depression. And I think the main problem is that a lot of us do not speak up about it. A lot of us do not think we have the resources or support systems needed. So back to the idea of having a support system, I think this is why we need to make sure that our guidance counselors, our mental health professionals, all the people that we deal with, and even beyond just mental health, in any aspect of society, if you're a minority, if you're anyone with a certain cultural background, people should be cognizant of that. They should be aware of that. And that's what our work is around. That's what ASAP's advocates work is around. So for my group of advocates at ASAP, we really want to make sure that we consider how we want to address the resource gaps within the APA community. And we want to debunk the model minority myth because, and I'm just going to switch over to another tab here, but for the model minority myth, right, a lot of people don't realize that what it really is it's just saying that we're going, okay, so you can see here, there's so many derogatory terms that APAs have been called throughout history, right? And the model minority myth merely tries to say that, oh, we're going to be successful, even though APAs are often not successful. A lot of the times we are discriminated against. We're painted as successful, even though a lot of us do not have equal educational opportunity, even though there's a lot of poverty, even though there are a lot of stereotypes. So in history, I'll just quickly go over a brief historical background. I hope I'm not boring anyone, so feel free to type in the chat if you have any questions again. But historically, after the 1900s, and you often don't hear this history in schools because schools obscure this history. Schools they don't show quote unquote ethnic studies, when in reality, these studies are just as American as any other histories that we have. Just like how Black History Month or Asian Pacific American Heritage Month should not be consigned to one month, they should be year round. We learn about these histories all the time. Then that's what we need. We need to make sure that we're teaching that history everywhere. So back to, yes, APA is equal to Asian Pacific American, if, as I clarified earlier. So back to this idea of us being discriminated against, we're seen as perpetual foreigners, and we face covert racism a lot. So a lot of the times people don't realize, because it isn't covered in the media, there have been many Asian Pacific Americans hurt by police so that's why we do have to have more solidarity with other minorities, as I definitely think so. A lot of the times Asian Pacific Americans, we lack that coverage, because even if you see in movies like Crazy Rich Asians, you see how there's this extravagant society portrayed, but that's really not what the majority of APAs are facing. A lot of us are facing poverty, evictions because we don't know English, or because 60% of Asian Pacific Americans are immigrants, are of immigrant descent. So that explains why a lot of them do not have the resources needed, because they can't speak English. So let's say there's a tenant. They feel that there's a power dynamic because they can't access the resources that a landlord is inhibiting from them or is preventing them from accessing. I know a lot of stories from where I'm from, Flushing, Queens. It's a very diverse area with a lot of immigrants, and we know that a lot of these immigrants' rights are not protected. So I'm just going to swap back to the main presentation, and we can see, again, right, it's really important to stand in solidarity for Asian Pacific Americans, consider our history, since a lot of the times we have not, well, people rarely know about our history because it's rarely taught in schools. I think that's a main thing to consider. So in our work, we really want to, so here's some work that we have done. We tried to consider mental health stigma. We've tried to consider how different ethnic groups are affected by the lack of mental health services. We also want to consider how a lot of APA youth do not have resources. And that's what I'm mainly trying to say. There are so many problems that people do not or are not able to access. I mean, there's so many resources that people are not able to access. So I'm going to take a quick minute to search for the tab that I had previously been on. Again, back to my campaign. Sorry, there are a bit of technical issues here. Let me see if this one works. Okay, good, it works again. Okay, so now that I've gone over cultural competency and the model minority myth, how we do face oppression by being considered invisible, being considered a quote unquote model minority when there is no such thing, right? Consider how oppression occurs because we're dividing and conquering. I mean, not we, I mean the oppressors, the people in power. They're the privileged individuals who are dividing and conquering. So we have to prevent that rampant discrimination, oppression, all of that. So back to the issues facing Asian Pacific Americans, like I mentioned, a lot of the times there's a lack of civic engagement. And what this means is we're not politically active because there isn't information or translated information about being politically active. And that's another failure of our education system. So we have to really acknowledge how, oh, thank you, Dominic. But we really have to acknowledge how we must include minorities' histories in education. We must include cultural competency. We have to include how a lot of cultures you have to be sensitive. You have to be sensitive about including people because you can't define their narratives for them. If you're defining someone's narrative for them, you're just deciding how they live their lives, and you're technically abusing your power. In the long run, this is what it leads to. In the long run, it leads to Asian Pacific Americans being considered second-class citizens in their own ways. People don't often hear about this narrative because, to sum it up for anyone who just joined, Asian Pacific Americans, there's this myth that we're all economically successful and that we're all hardworking, worker bees. But there are so many ways that we're discriminated against. The vast majority of us barely even make it into certain fields. Some of us even want to be artists, but we're not able to because there's this internalized racism that we have to go into STEM fields because of the model minority myth. And I also want to go over the idea of data disaggregation, which is the notion that in the census, and you know the 2020 census is coming up, so everyone should try to get involved in that. But the idea of data disaggregation is that you need to break up ethnic groups. You need to make sure, not break them, you need to label them clearly so that people know they exist. If you lump groups together, even the term Asian Pacific American, if you lump Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders together, you're hiding history in a way, because you have to be cognizant, aware of what each group wants to share, and let people decide for themselves what they want to share about their own histories and needs. So that's all very important. Also, back to the campaign of ASAP, why are we having culturally competent mental health services? So I'm really happy to say this is a very condensed version of what we're trying to advocate for. Our needs is that we're invisibilized, and there's mental health stigma, which means a lot of APA youth do not reach out to their school counselors because they don't know that those resources exist. They think that, and often a lot of the times, any minority can attest to this. A lot of the times we face microaggressions. People think, oh, just because you're Asian Pacific American, just because you look, your features, your physical features are resembling an East Asian American individual, for example, you must know how to eat with chopsticks. So there's this racist idea. A lot of the times there are these race-based bullying. That race-based bullying is very obvious, and I think people often think that's the only form of discrimination Asian Americans face, and that's not true, but it is definitely there. So we need to acknowledge that. And we also need to consider how we want our school systems to be very equitable. I know a lot of activist organizations, not just my own, across the city. They all want it to integrate schools, desegregate schools, make sure that Black and Latinx communities and APA communities have the same educational opportunities, and also stop pitting racial minorities against each other. So we have to consider, and again, everyone, feel free to ask any questions in the chat if you want. So just reminding you all, you can feel free to add anything, but we need to keep in mind how we have to take charge as young people as well as activists to make policy decisions and to really consider how APA individuals, we have our own freedom. We cannot limit ourselves. We have to think for ourselves. We have to think for ourselves and really consider how we might be used as pawns by other people, because we are human beings in our own way, and we have to really take charge of ourselves, really consider that. And I know that it's hard because even in my school is predominantly Asian Pacific American. Isn't the racism factor by the, yeah, so there was some racism because of the Vietnam War, the history. So this could go into a much longer discussion as well. But I'll definitely answer this briefly from what I know. I know that there has been an imperialist and colonialist history of the US, and the US has tried to hide from the media that it has propaganda promoting itself and promoting its own colonies, such as even the French colonization of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, all that, trying to go against communism. And racism was spurred by that. That was one reason. But I definitely wouldn't say that's a main reason for racism. Racism has always existed. Racism has not just been due solely to the Vietnam War or the Chinese Communist Party. But good questions. So back to the campaign, I'm now going to go over. So I have 4 minutes left for my first session. I'm going to re-present after this, but I'm going to go over the survey and interview tracks of ASAP, of what we've been doing so far. So the survey and interview tracks include the work that we have been working on for the past few, I think, months, for the past 6 months, I think. So in case anyone's confused, in the Asian American Student Advocacy Project, there are two teams called the survey team and the interview team. So for each of these teams, I'm part of the survey team, so I'm not part of the interview team. I'm going to share my screen now for the survey team. So what we have been doing is we have been trying to, okay, I'm sure everyone can see now, we've been trying to outline variables. This is the interview team's work, right? So here's a glimpse of what we have been working on. This is a presentation that we used to briefly describe our campaign. And we've also created survey questions. To briefly go over this, we have tried to outline our progress. We tried to be very specific. Our mentor has tried to tell us to be very specific, consider independent variables and dependent variables, and that's what we have been doing. Also, I'm now going to sum up our work. So I will head on right back to the original tab that I had been on. Yes, Asian American is Asian, ASAP is Asian American Student Advocacy Project, not just Asian, yeah. But thank you for trying to define that. So I'll go to the post I was just on right here, okay. Okay, so let's just see, okay. So back to where I'm at. Now let's go over this summary of what ASAP is about and what we have been working on. I know the text is a bit hard to read here, but the point is we have been working on showing how APA youth, we're not going to be dehumanized anymore. We're not going to be reduced to this model minority myth. Oh, thank you, Jonathan. We're not going to be seen as, we're not going to let depression, suicidal ideation, social anxiety, all that overcome us. We're going to advocate for ourselves. We're going to make sure that we collect our own data, our own experiences. We rewrite our own stories, make sure that we have our own surveys, have our own interviews, and really use all this to reshape the Asian American narrative and the Pacific Islander narrative in the US, because a lot of the times people, again, have these misconceptions about Asian Pacific American individuals. Also, it's really important because as we know in this hostile political climate, we have to really stand in solidarity for Black Lives Matter and for various other groups. And if we want to take that step towards solidarity, we have to first care about ourselves and tidy up our own divisions. And again, because the media wrongly portrays us a lot of the times as one whole group of people and not a bunch of diverse groups, because really we are very diverse. There are almost 60 ethnicities in the Asian Pacific American group, then the media often pits us against each other because we don't have information, right? A lot of this relates to how Asian Pacific Americans, what we face isn't direct discrimination. We're not really hurt by the justice system so much. We're not really hurt by incarceration or a school to prison pipeline. We're hurt by people defining our narratives and trying to make us things that we're not. We're hurt by people trying to permanently subjugate us, render us second-class citizens. We're hurt by this quote-unquote model minority myth, when really that just shows the failure of the American education system and the failure of American meritocracy, because meritocracy doesn't exist when you don't have equity on all levels. So to end this presentation, make sure to follow the Instagram at CACFASAP. I will type that in the chat. And oh, thanks, Carly. But also, before I finish, I want to talk about how you can get involved. For us, for ASAP, because our campaign hasn't really been solidified yet, a lot of people don't know how they can get involved. So I would just say, first of all, try to follow us on social media, follow other activists across social media, follow a lot of activists, and try to really read their work. Read their work, talk about their work, and open dialogue. So I know for my school, I'm currently working on this event in conjunction with the Black Student Union, and we're trying to talk about Black Lives Matter and trying to combat anti-Blackness in the APA community, because we need solidarity and we all care about human rights as a whole. It's not just about transactions. It's about really advocating for each other, because we're all human beings. We all should be united, and we all should embrace our unique differences. So that's something that we've gone over. And a lot of people are also confused about lobbying, all that political jargon. And I would say, don't worry too much about that. As long as you embody yourself as an activist, think about how you can break the mindset that Asian Pacific Americans are perpetual foreigners. Think about doing all that. Oh, thanks, Johnny. But think about doing all that. Think about how you yourself, I would say everyone can be an activist as long as you yourself think about a certain mindset, about how you can free yourself from stereotypical ideas that society tells you. Thanks, Elise. So you really just have to learn to embrace your own differences and challenge yourself. So I've now wrapped up the first round of presenting. I'm assuming new individuals have come. Oh, thanks, Medina. So I'm just going to restart this whole presentation. If anyone wants to stay, you could, but I think you can also join some new sessions since you all have time. So, okay, I'm just going to restart. Thank you, Sachi. All right. Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks everyone. I'll drink water later. Yeah, I hear from people that I talk a lot sometimes. So starting again, I see the page has not loaded. Oh, here, it has loaded now. So, hey everyone, my name is Sophie Xu. I'm from the Asian American Student Advocacy Project. I am a youth leader, also youth activist, and I'm here today to describe my campaign, my program's campaign for culturally competent mental health services in New York City schools. So what does this mean? So first of all, I want to go over what ASAP is because a lot of people might not know what it is. So it's just a student program for youth leaders to really educate themselves and their communities, really try to break stereotypes, but more importantly, explain the full picture or story behind them. Because think about it, if you keep trying to refute stereotypes, you're not addressing the real problems at hand. The real problems at hand is, why did these stereotypes come to exist in the first place? How can you paint the narrative behind them? And I think that's really important. So if you want, you can always apply for ASAP. We're still accepting applications. And now let's go over the model minority myth and cultural competency. So what do each of these mean? First of all, the model minority myth is the idea that Asian Pacific Americans all have to be submissive worker bees who are fetishized. Okay, I'm so sorry, I keep mispronouncing that. Fetishized, I think. Yeah, fetishized. And also Asian Pacific American individuals, we face a lot of oppression and misrepresentation as well as underrepresentation, both in the census and in a lot of, I think, media in general, media as well as laws, because people rarely think of Asian Pacific Americans as a voting bloc, and you can see how everything ties together. That's a narrative I really want to paint. Every form of discrimination and oppression ties together. Nothing is directly unique because we see how everything is unique in disabling one group of people from achieving their humanistic potentials. So if I zoom in right here, you all can hopefully see this diagram about how a lot of people are impoverished. These ethnicities within the APA group, you see how the Hmong ethnicity is 26% of the Hmong population in the US is in extreme poverty. 20% of Bangladeshi Americans in the US are also in extreme poverty. So we have to really consider how Asian Pacific Americans are not a monolith, like the media portrays us. A monolith is just a whole group, a homogenous group. We're not a monolith. We have various needs that need to be addressed, and we're hurt in our own ways. So because Asian and Pacific Americans' needs are often not addressed, that brings me to the main point of the campaign, cultural competency. So what does this mean? It means that whatever interactions you're having with people or whatever groups you're joining with, you will always try to consider people's cultures or whatever, when applicable, not always, because if someone is a fifth generation American and they rarely identify with the transnational identity of being, let's say they're originally Pakistani American, but they're fifth generation, then it might not be that applicable to see them as a Pakistani American when they themselves want to be identified as something else, right? So you have to really give people the authority to decide their identities for themselves. But at the same time, this is where gray area comes in, because you can't just identify as whatever you want to identify. You have a political identity, and you have identities that you can't choose, such as whether you're able or not. So let's go over the model minority myth now. The model minority myth is really disabling because it tries to paint Asian Pacific Americans. And to anyone who's new to this session, you can always comment in the chat or ask any questions. But the model minority myth tries to paint Asian Pacific Americans as submissive, hardworking, and there's so many. That's such a myth, because if you realize how there's this huge myth, by the way, about how the economy is, well, economically, Asian Pacific Americans are growing a lot. That's really not true. A lot of us face extreme poverty. In fact, about 60% of us are immigrants. That means a lot of immigrants are facing language access barriers, are facing a whole set of problems that come with lack of political engagement and lack of not knowing language, and that's very hypocritical of the US, because there is no official language in America. We have to consider that, right? So aside from these problems, we can see this diagram summing up what we face. So we face a lack of civic engagement. That means a lot of us aren't politically involved because we don't have information about getting politically involved. And that in turn leads to the ripple effect of not being civically engaged, which means we can't vote for ourselves and represent ourselves in higher offices. That means we're further invisibilized. So as you can see, I'm trying to paint the theme that everything is related. We also see a lack of data disaggregation. What does this mean? This means that a lot of information that people have, what they do is they don't have that information classified based on Asian Pacific Americans' ethnicities. So what does this mean? This means that, let's say I'm even grouping Asian Pacific Americans together. In the first place, that's a very problematic action to do, which is why it's totally understandable that you don't see this acronym a lot. If I say Asian Pacific Americans, a lot of Pacific American individuals might not identify with Asians. So that's why we want that data disaggregation. So aggregation just means you're combining. Disaggregation means you need to decombine. So that's what we're trying to do. Also, for mental health services, we know that all these problems are connected. So if someone is less likely to speak English, oh, thank you, Stella. Yeah, feel free to comment, everyone. But if someone is unable to speak English, then that means they're unable to speak with their guidance counselors or access their treatment for depression, for example. So you can see how everything again is related. And that relates to stereotypes, which are bred by the American dream, which is a complete myth, and the meritocratic dream, which is also a complete myth. Because what do these two mean? I just want to quickly go over, what does a meritocracy mean? A meritocracy is the idea that everyone can work hard and become successful. It's that stereotypical, if you can work hard, why can't they? But this is a myth, because think about it. A lot of the times, Black communities have been disadvantaged historically by slavery and by capitalism. Asian Pacific American communities have been disadvantaged by the Chinese Exclusion Act, and later they only entered America again, mostly after 1943, when the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And a lot of Asian Pacific Americans came after the 60s, when there's this other immigration act. So you have to consider how the government has tried to exclude and include certain groups and define them as American over time. Different minorities, we all have our different struggles, but it's really important that we stand in solidarity together. And I just want to quickly go over how, I've said this a lot in the last session, but the main problem, the main way APAs are oppressed, the main way Asian Pacific Americans are oppressed, is that our stories are not painted, and they're not painted accurately as well. So if you see in medias, even in, let's say, the movie Crazy Rich Asians, you see this extravagant lifestyle that is portrayed. I don't know if I've said this already, but if we see this lifestyle, it hides the poverty that a lot of APAs face. We also see that APAs are seen as not people of color, when we really are. We are people of color. We also stand in solidarity with other minorities. It's merely because we don't have access to information sometimes that we don't realize, let's say, the value in supporting affirmative action. So I really think it's important to think for yourself, think freely for yourself, and try to educate yourself whenever possible. So back to the campaign itself. I know I went over history a lot because I love to go deeply into sociology and history, but let's go over what culturally competent mental health services do for our communities. For any group, we need to consider how a lot of kids, a lot of youth are scared to reach out to their guidance counselors. They don't even care about their guidance counselors, and they have suicidal thoughts on a daily basis, a lot of them. Why does this run so rampantly? Because a lot of the times it's minority individuals who lack a trust of the guidance counselors, who sometimes abuse their authority, or they simply lack the connection with the youth because they don't try to understand the culture of the youth. So that's why we want at ASAP, what we want to do at the Asian American Student Advocacy Project, we want to build a school system so that all minorities are included, so that everyone feels safe and they're able to create their own policy recommendations or ideas about what they want to do. So what this means is we want to take charge, we want to take initiative, we want to make sure that we destigmatize mental health and say, hey, it's okay, just because in a lot of the times in East Asian culture specifically, a lot of the times people have the idea that seeking out for mental health equates to shame. You're going to shame yourself if you reach out to mental health, and you're going to just disgrace the family, you're going to dishonor them. But that's really not true. We need to break this mindset that you're going to fall into a spiral of dishonoring yourself, and that's not true, because I think it's actually strong if you do something that you're not comfortable doing. It's actually strong to do that and resilient. So I'm now going to go over, well, actually, I could go over some survey and interview work that we've done. I originally would share screen for another slide. I'll actually see if I can do that right now. If not, that's fine too. But what we were doing is the survey and interview teams have been working on questions. We worked on questions and we tried to identify our main problems and be specific with them. So what does this mean? This means that we were targeting certain groups of people and making sure that in each group that we were targeting, we considered their perspectives. So we also tried to outline a lot of variables, such as independent variables and dependent variables. And what does this even mean? What does this jargon mean? So independent variables included factors that affected school systems. So they could include people's usage, rate of talking to guidance counselors, rate of talking about mental health to their peers. What could be an example of a dependent variable? An example is people's awareness of mental health. So that's a dependent variable. Another could be people's attitudes towards mental health. So these are factors that we try to thoroughly analyze. So back to the original campaign, we can see how advocates really tried to reach out widely to a lot of people. We're still in the works of this, so this campaign is really a work in progress, but we have tried to publicize our work on our social media as well, really try to break the model minority myth and explain the story behind it, because I think educating yourself is even more important. And we have also try to make sure that we combat stress, combat the high rates of depression, suicidal ideation, and social anxiety among APA youth. Because at the end of the day, what am I trying to get at? I'm trying to get at bettering my own communities, bettering the lives of minorities as a whole, making sure that we have access to equitable mental health services so that we fight harmful effects of capitalism, fight injustices that occur on a wide scale, and make sure that everyone has equal access to equal resources. So that's what ASAP stands for at the end of the day. And I think that it's really important I just want to put out a message of solidarity out there about how a lot of Asian Pacific Americans, we lack. So I think the main narrative I've been trying to say again, I'll keep saying this because I think it's so important, is again, Asian Pacific Americans are disadvantaged not because of direct racism sometimes, but because of covert racism, hidden racism that renders our voices invisible and that decides our narratives for us without our permission. So a lot of the times media portrays us as a certain way. It pits us against the Black communities, Latinx communities, and other communities of color. And that's not true. We don't want that to happen because we have to stand in solidarity with other minorities, support human rights, and advocate for people's rights as a whole. So that's what I've been trying to get at how we're uniquely disadvantaged in a lot of ways, in so many aspects of life. But this does not mean I'm trying to paint a sob story of any sort. This means that I'm trying to urge people to take action because everyone has their own mishmashes of privilege and oppression. It's not just APA individuals, although I'm specifically focusing on APA individuals. And in case anyone hasn't heard, APA stands for Asian Pacific American. So back to how anyone can get involved. So for my campaign, I think anyone can get involved by widely reading and educating themselves on topics like the model minority myth, topics like stereotypes, topics like historical racism when the country tried to include and exclude certain people. We saw this in the Japanese internment camps, saw this in how minorities were eager to prove themselves as allies during times of war. So we really have to educate ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, if you embody activism, you're already an activist. A lot of people think you have to become a lawmaker, you have to become a lobbyist, you have to lobby or reach out to high-skill organizations in order to become an activist. But I don't think so. I think you just need to embody the ideals of standing up for yourself. If you speak up for yourself and educate yourself on all ideas that matter to you, then you are doing exactly what activists should do. And you are doing exactly what is required of any person who is going to think for themselves and be an active thinker. And again, if anyone has any comments, feel free to add them to the chat. And I'm also going to go over how ASAP, our social media is CACF ASAP. Anyone can feel free to join us. Anyone can apply. We have applications open on our website. But I think even more importantly, I hope everyone took away the themes of the very untold stories of Asian Pacific Americans in the media, in the US, and how our struggles are unique in our own ways, and we have unique struggles that people rarely acknowledge. So I'll just stay around for a little bit to just discuss any points that people could make. But I think the main idea is how we do lack a lot of data on how Asian Pacific Americans, individual ethnicity groups, are doing. And we need to raise awareness of that data. We need to make public information. And think about it. If we decided to translate resources so that there's linguistic accessibility, if we try to increase funding for very unknown causes that people don't know about because there's little resources, then we can really elevate people's quality of life. We can make sure that there's a step closer to equality if we address work that people often don't care about. If we consider young people's health, mental health, if we stop stigmatizing mental health, if we consider young people's needs, then we're really combating all the oppressive structures that history has built until now. So thank you for attending this session.